but I'm going to go from the granular to like the biggest treetop topic you can possibly select, just because it hit me in regards to just somebody had mentioned in the live chat about everybody else playing for second place in the Big Ten. And for anybody under the age of like 25 who loves Ohio State football, they just consider it a birthright, winning the Big Ten championship. And I know Ohio State has not won every Big Ten championship, but it's been as dominant as any team in any league in the country over the last 15 years. And when they haven't won the Big Ten championship, people typically still think they're the best team in the Big Ten because of certain circumstances involved in the most talented. But we've all lived through the 8-4s and, you know, the like records to that. We could go through the litany of late 80s teams, early 90s teams, and then the last few Cooper teams other than the 98 team, you know, the 99 team that lost 6 games. So this is not automatic. What could you guys possibly see down the road that derails this thing? Because it just seems to be it's on a roll from every possible aspect.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that you just got to keep the recruiting going. I mean, you could have all this great coaching and whatnot, but if you don't have the athletes, it's really not going to matter at that point. So, you know, Urban had this team recruiting at the next level. Ryan Day's first class, top 5 class, already has a great, you know, I'm talking his first full class, the one that just signed or is signing on Wednesday. Already number 2 in the class of 2021 at this point. But, you know, I think if you sit there and you really look at it, it's going to take the West to step up at this point. I mean, you can sit there and look at the Big Ten East, but the Big Ten East is going to cannibalize itself to a certain extent with Michigan, Michigan State, Penn State, all on that side. I think it's going to take the West to really rise up and be the way that would knock Ohio State off its throne in terms of on the field play. And at this point, you know, Wisconsin puts together some nice teams, but they haven't really been capable here during this stretch of knocking off Ohio State. If Ohio State trips up, it's been against Iowa. It's been against Purdue. It's been one of these games that everybody sits there in circles as a trap game. That's not going to be enough to knock off Ohio State or necessarily even the East at that point. You know, Wisconsin or Nebraska or somebody's going to have to really put it together at this point. And none of those schools are necessarily in strong recruiting areas to where they can just sit there and put a fence around, you know, 150 miles around where they are and say, well, we're going to ride or die with this. So, I mean, they already are at a bit of a disadvantage just based on geography at that point. And then going against the East and just getting cannibalized, you know, just crushed over on that side. But, you know, to make the story shorter, I would sit there and say ultimately it comes down to recruiting. If Ohio State starts to falter in recruiting, if Ohio State starts losing a lot more coaches and Ryan Day maybe make some bad hires at that point, which we haven't seen at this point, that could also be a huge role in that. But it comes down to the athletes.
Yeah, I would agree with Kevin. It is 70%, 75% recruiting at this point. As we say, the quality of the product going in is commensurate with the quality of the product coming out, and Ohio State has been able to avoid, in large part, those costly upsets. I mean, as he said, Iowa and Purdue, I wouldn't necessarily say they're outliers, but, you know, I think that when Ohio State takes the field, they're typically anywhere from a 1 to 4 touchdown favorite over most of the teams that they play during the regular season, at least. Now, going to Oregon, you know, this year, they're catching Oregon at a good time. And I know we're going to talk about the schedule here in a minute, but them losing Herbert, obviously, you know, that may sit well for Ohio State as a time to go to Oregon when they're breaking in a new quarterback. But in general, what this is going to take to topple this program is a bad head coaching hire at some point, and somebody who and they've almost recruiting proofed themselves because they are no longer dependent on the state of Ohio solely to be the backbone of this program. You know, you go back to Tressel, half of his classes were Ohio guys. If he signed 25 guys, 12 or 13 of them were from Ohio. And, you know, yeah, and it was the A.J. Hawks, the Bobby Carpenters, the Maurice Clarettes, you know, Troy Smiths, Justin Zwicks, Doug Daddish, I could go on down the line, all these guys from Ohio who ended up being 3 and 4 year guys, well, 2 or 3 year starters, at Ohio State that they depended on. They're no longer dependent on the state of Ohio. In fact, they come back to Ohio and look for the top 4 or 5 guys from Ohio. I mean, Paris Johnson is a guy from Ohio. You would have taken him in 1995. You would have taken him in 2005, and you take him in 2020. I mean, that was a no-brainer. But they fall back in Ohio to complement what they're able to get outside the state of Ohio, and they've built those relationships in so many pockets of the country right now with the assistant coaches that they have that what would short circuit this, and I can't even come up with a name of a guy who would be so undynamic as a recruiter that he would come in and the machinery would grind to a halt. The best thing Gene Smith did was to retain Ryan Day, and I say this after one season. We may think differently about this after 5 years or 3 years, depending on how the next couple of seasons go, but things seem to be, again, I did a thing last week on the site, 18 websites, 17 of them have Clemson number 1 and Ohio State number 2 for next year, and the other one has Ohio State number 1 and Clemson number 2. So if we just fast forwarded to January 11th of next year and had those two playing each other, that'd be fine with me. We'd be guaranteed our trip to Miami, Kev. How about that? That's good stuff. But, it seems to me like he's got this thing pointed in the right direction. He appears to be a very good hire. And the most important thing was by retaining him and by Urban Meyer not taking another job yet, in parenthesis, the Pantonis, the Maratis, the Voltolinis, the Quinn guy, and everybody else, from A to Z, soup to nuts, they all needed to have jobs. And they were only too happy for those guys to stay at Ohio State and keep that machinery churning. Boom, 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 boom. It's a whole machine. And so far they've kept it intact, and nobody in the Big Ten can touch them, on a consistent, if we played 100 times, Ohio State's going to win 94 of those games against all 13 of the other schools as things are constituted today.
Because I think we would all agree that aside from some of those John Cooper teams in 1993, 95, 96, 98, from about 1980, 81 in that range, when Woody left, Earl Bruce had the one big year when they almost won the national championship, and then they settled into that. Excuse me, everyone out there, hang with me. They settled into that 9-3 mode with Earl, and then from pretty much that time, again, except for some of the standout Cooper teams, for about 20 years, they weren't necessarily a top 5 program. They were more like a top 15 program. And what's happened in America that has impacted recruiting more than anything, for me, unless you guys come up with something else in the last 20 or 25 years, are people moving west and people are moving south, population shift. That has not it's affected everybody. It's affected Nebraska. It's affected just across the board. The only 3 schools that I can think of that come close to Ohio State, and they really don't come close in the Rust Belt, would be Notre Dame, Penn State, and Michigan in regards to being able to go anywhere in the country and grab players. Ohio State, it's basically college football is the South, and I won't even say the entirety of the South. It's Clemson, Georgia, Alabama, LSU pretty much. And Ohio State, they rule college football, and LSU is just we don't know if it's going to last. Even with great respect given to the Oklahomas and, again, Michigan, Notre Dame, Penn State, they're not quite there. They can go to Florida and get some guys, but really even the better teams in the Big Ten, as Kevin alluded to, Wisconsin, they go to Florida and they get the 3rd and 4th tier guys. They're getting some athletes out of there. Ohio State's able to go to Florida and California and get the top guys. Why has Ohio State been able to distinguish itself more than anybody else in the country that's not in the Deep South? It fascinates me.
It certainly doesn't hurt that now you can see any game, anywhere, anytime, pretty much on any device.
But Kevin, wouldn't you think that would work against the major powers? That would give the little guys an equal footing, that you would see more balance, but we see less balance in college football.
I know, but football's still pretty tribal in terms of that, though. when Ohio State, I mean, there's certain areas Ohio State just doesn't recruit because they're not going to be able to pull guys out of there. I mean, Ohio State, for as big as the brand is and everything else, how often do they go into Mississippi and recruit a kid? How often can they go into the state of Alabama and recruit a kid? Their success in the state of Louisiana is marginal at best. I mean, but they've been able to go into Idaho to get Tommy Togiai. They've been able to go into Utah to be able to pull some kids. Right now, nobody's staying out in California at this point, but it's Clemson that's going out and crushing it in 2021 right now with some picking up Bo Collins and some guys like that at this point. But, I think that with the fact is that now that you can see games anywhere, anytime, on all of these outlets or whatnot, it does allow for, I think it levels the playing field in certain aspects, but these kids still want to win. And they're, the programs that are winning right now are the ones you mentioned in the South and Ohio State at this point. And, you sit there and you look and you see what's going on with who's putting guys into the league, and, having ambassadors like Michael Thomas and guys like that certainly does not hurt. Nick Bosa getting the NFL Rookie of the Year more so than just defense. I mean, the overall Rookie of the Year. These guys being on the big stage. So, there's so much going into it at this point. But, ultimately, we sit there and people flip out when, a kid comes out for a visit and the team may lose. It's like, well, that's it. You got to cross them off the list. Well, kids aren't necessarily concerned with one loss at that point. But, there are not a lot of kids that are going to want to go in and go to, I'm not going to pick on any school in particular, but a school that's going 3-9 all the time, it's very difficult for one kid to completely affect the bottom line, more so than like in basketball, where if you bring in a star player in basketball, fortunes can change a lot quicker. But in football, outside a quarterback, it's a lot more difficult for one guy to be able to sit there and turn the tide.
I don't know if you've got anything on this, Steve, but I just find it fascinating, again, that we've got like 4 or 5 power brokers in the sport, and Ohio State's the one team from outside the Deep South that can be elite and arguably the best program in the country.
Yeah, I would agree with a lot of what Kevin said. I think exposure is a big thing, and that the networks in general, even, Ohio State fans have a deep-seated hatred for ESPN, but, ESPN, to their credit, understands the importance of Ohio State, and Fox, the Fox and Ohio State brands are basically joined at the hip right now in terms of promoting one another, it seems like. I mean, you couldn't be a bigger promoter of Ohio State football right now than Fox is. And I think that some of that subliminally comes across that to, people, kids, that this is a big deal. It is up there with Clemson and Alabama. And the people in Ohio treat it like a religion, and it does mean everything. And I think that when you have guys like Jordan Fuller, J.K. Dobbins, Chase Young, come from all over the country to this one location, all of them thousands of miles from home, and they're all able to attain fortune and fame playing this great game that they all love. I think in some ways it's kind of like Notre Dame may have been back in the 70s and 80s, that it's a national brand that is almost untouchable. And I think, and I don't mean to be hyperbolic about this and say crazy things, but it's just like there is something very special going on at Ohio State on an annual, year in, year out basis. We're going to go to the Combine here later in February. Kevin and I, we go every year. There's going to be another 8 or 9 Ohio State guys at the Combine. Jonah Jackson came a complete nobody, a complete no one at Rutgers, so far under the radar. Comes to Ohio State, now they're talking about him being one of the first guards taken in the NFL draft. I mean, and I'm not saying that Greg Studrawa made him a great player. I'm just saying he was put in meaningful football games against great competition, and he performed well. And people saw it, and he went to the Senior Bowl, and he played well. That's what Ohio State can do for you with the platform, the coaching, the competition, and everything that comes together with it. That's what they're selling right now to prospective recruits, and kids all over the country are only too happy to eat it up.